So, with the return of Havana, the Spanish began strengthening the defenses and fortification along with its other colonies. The Spanish would rely on using stationed military troops, which the provincial militia would complement. The idea was for officers to train the new militia, and eventually the local elite would purchase commissions to replace them. Then these troops would serve as a reserve force to help in the event of an invasion, like in Havana. The number of troops stationed in the Americas rose from 8,000 soldiers in 1739 to 14,000 in 1770. From 1770 to 1800, the numbers rose to more than 29,000. Now, to get more people to join the militia, the Spanish crown extended the benefit of having what we call the military fuero. This was the judicial right for officers, soldiers, and their dependents to have their civil and criminal cases heard by a military court. But since that attracted too little people to join the militia, the Spanish looked in taverns, gambling dens, and jails to find recruits that they could force in the militia. Whoa. While wealthy Creoles, right, again, the descendants of Spaniards born in the Americas, served as low-ranking officers in the army, Spaniards from the peninsula, or peninsulares, held the highest ranks such as general or lieutenant colonel. This point forced a feel of discrimination that Creoles felt in terms of not having the high positions open. Right, so let's unpack this. So the first part of these second reforms essentially are sort of the physical aspect, defense, right? Because our defense failed us, so we need to fortify it to make it stronger, right? So yes, we do see more stationed military troops in the Americas, but with the idea that they could rely on the militia, which is another way of saying their National Guard, to complement it, right? Because with so much territory, right? If you think back to the map in the beginning, it's not very, wouldn't be very prudent or practical, right, for one large standing army to cover all that territory. And so you have your standing army there as sort of backup. Like I had said, you have officers training the local militia that eventually replace them, right? Serving as this reserve force, which, if an invasion were to happen again, like in Havana, the station troops would have the backup of the locals, right? And the idea, I guess, would be to have had station troops in sort of the major areas. So like Havana would have been one, Mexico City, Lima, etc., right? And you see this the number of soldiers rising over the years, right? And again, to make up for this humiliating defeat that we talked about earlier to the Spanish at the hands of the British, losing Havana, right? And only essentially getting it because British didn't need it anymore, right? It was the terms of the treaty. They had other things that they were focused on, right? And so the question is, how do you get more people into the army, right? And so in colonial Latin America, and in Spain, Spanish side, different positions had special privileges, special laws that you could invoke depending on where you were at. And this was the case with the militia, being in the military, having military fuero. And some of those of us have familiar with the military, right? Soldiers, active duty, who get into trouble, also have their own courts too, depending on the nature of the crime and how it occurred and different kinds of laws, right, that I won't get into. So the military fuero kind of operates similarly, but it's just with the option of having the military court hear cases, which might be more favorable to someone serving, right, if they get into any trouble. But that carrot didn't work, right? It didn't attract enough people to fill these positions, right, because they're looking to expand the army and the local force, the militia. And so they just start recruiting people and forcing them into the militia, right? You're in jail? Want to get out? No? Okay, part of the militia. Raiding gambling dens and taverns, and you could have just imagined the kind of people you would find in these places. Maybe not morally the most upstanding in terms of views of society, and thinking about that in terms of reliability, perhaps too. But again, they are looking to meet a quota, right? And they're at least successful, as we saw with the numbers again, right? So we're looking at starting in 1733 to 14,000, and then by 1800, no, excuse me, no, 8,000, right? And then getting to 29,000. So they are successful in boosting the amount of troops that they have there. But again, you still see these some discrepancies, some discrimination in terms of the positions, the highest positions, who they're being reserved for. And that does become problematic, especially later. But at least we get to see the military side of the Bourbon Reforms, right? So let's take a look at what they do with the provinces in that aspect. All right. So we're coming back here to this map where we have the Viceroyalty of New Spain and the Viceroyalty of Peru. So the threat of attack to their territories within and touching the Caribbean, along with the problem of contraband trade, led the Spanish to go about reorganizing the administrative and territorial system. Now, previously, as you could see on the map, the Spanish divided their territories into administrative units called viceroyalties. And there were two that the Spanish carved out from the former Aztec and Inca empires, right? Viceroyalty of New Spain, Viceroyalty of Peru. And so beginning in 1739, the Spanish created a new viceroyalty from the northern portions of what is the Viceroyalty of Peru, which would become the Viceroyalty of New Granada. And also with the southern parts, I should say, of New Spain, right? And that contains sort of focus on the Caribbean side, right? So to deal with the military attack and commercial contraband from its southeastern portion of Spanish territory, they created the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in 1777, which encompasses the modern-day nations of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and parts of Chile, right? And so, I mean, if you're looking at the size of these things, my goodness, my goodness. Now, that's not to say, right, that political rule happened strictly in Mexico City and Lima. No, there were other cities that weren't necessarily capital cities per se, but were regional cities that had other aspects of government, right? So Quito and what is Ecuador, Bogota and Colombia, and to some extent, Havana, right, would be one of those places, right? Administrative places that had officials there. But this could be very problematic. And if we think about what we've learned in American history, you've seen that on the British side, dividing into different colonies with their own capitals. So it's not necessarily something that is different in the sense of dividing colonies to be more efficient in terms of administration, right? And so in the sense of dealing with contraband, right, and to deal with the military attack, which had happened, right, in Havana, they create one in northern South America that also touches on the Caribbean, right, and that is New Granada. In the southeast, sort of going on South America, we have Rio de la Plata, right? And so with these creations of these two new viceroyalties, fairly recent, right? Especially when we get into independence, it at least helps with making things more efficient. All right, and so we have an after. If we look, hopefully the map doesn't appear too small, of how the configuration looked after the Bourbon Reforms, right? Where you have the new viceroyalty, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, sort of there, encompassing what is Panama, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela. Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, naming those places I said earlier. Then you have Brazil, which is, sort of Portuguese already, and really, oh, and also even parts of, I think, even further in Central America. And then you have, Viceroyalty of New Spain, having the Caribbean and what is Mexico and parts of Central America, right? And that's what we have looking at here. I also wanted to talk about another political reform that the Spanish went about doing, right? And so previously, and I think we had mentioned this in another part of another video, By allowing the Creoles, right, the descendants of those Spanish born in the Americas, and others to buy appointments and positions, it created a corrupt and inefficient bureaucracy. And so, as the result, was that the Spanish crown wanted tighter control over administration and more direct control over taxation. So, they couldn't necessarily buy out the Creoles, right, who had purchased these positions. So, what they did was they just added new positions to the government to dilute their influence. And when the opportunity would present itself, right, came to appoint a new office, the Spanish would just place a peninsular, someone from Spain, in their place, right? So, to give you an example, in 1750, 13 out of the 18 ministers of the Audiencia, or the court of Lima, right, were held by those born in the colony. By 1780, only 5 positions from those born in the colonies remained, right? And the thing is, right, if you think of it from the perspective of the Spanish government, you have these people who have these positions that they didn't earn by merit or any faculty or to be administrators, but they did it because they had wealth, and that was a way for the Spanish to raise wealth, raise capital, get money. But it just resulted in inefficiency, right? Corruption, people stealing from the government. And when you're focused on streamlining things and being more efficient, right? Perhaps it's only natural then that we would see the Spanish wanting to put in place people that they can trust, or the Spanish government from the peninsula. More so, they're not invested in the place that they're staying in, whereas someone who's buying up positions in the city of Lima and who's un limeño, una limeña, or a family from Lima, they've got more invested living there and could benefit themselves and their families, right? Temptation was too great. And so this is what the Spanish did to help to circumvent that, right? Gradually, as you could see it. But in a 30-year span, to go from 13 to 18 to 5, right? You've reduced those numbers by half, a little more than half, right? So it's working. So let's take a look now in what the Spanish do for church reform. Right, so the Catholic Church was a part of the colonial bureaucracy, that is the government, and was a major pillar of Iberian power in the Americas. Now, the Pope had granted the Spanish and Portuguese royal patronage, which is the ability to have major control over appointing high clergy, religious institutions, and control over the conversion of the natives. Now, the church sent out different religious orders of priests to evangelize the natives, such as the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits, which you see here a portrait of a Jesuit off somewhere, evangelizing, converting people. Now, these religious orders owned land in the colony, and with the church became a major lender of capital. The church also gained money from tithes, fees for marriage, burial, and other religious services. And then the priests sold goods in the marketplace for extra money, right? And so, in and of itself, the church was a part of the bureaucracy, right? Helped the crown working together to enforce order. Now, unlike in other, well, I should say, let me take a step back, right? And so, with the Reformation, nations such as the British and the Dutch, right, they didn't have to worry about having to share power, right, with the Catholic Church, right? They had their own churches. But in this extent for the Portuguese and the Spanish, what they were able to do was to cut a deal with the Pope, right? And that is having the ability to control, to some extent, religious officials, right? Because they have the blessing of the Pope to do that, right? So appointing archbishops to preside over religious functions who sometimes could serve as government officials, right? Control over religious institutions, and controlling how Native Americans were converted, if they even were, to Christianity, even with working with different religious orders. Now, Jesuits are different because the Jesuits had their own sort of autonomy, right? And because they had their autonomy, they were able to gain lands, right? Buy up land, lend, become major sources of lending, and besides getting rich off the land that they had people cultivating on, they made money from tithes, right? 10% of whatever it is that you made. If you want to get married, there's only way you can get married was through the church. You had to pay money for that. If you want someone to be buried, the cemetery, church cemetery, money for that, and other religious services, right? So the church was wealthy in colonial society. Now contrast that with the Bourbons, right? And so they followed this broad policy known as regalism. And under regalism, the Spanish monarchs, or the Bourbons, they wanted to increase their authority at the expense of other institutions such as the Catholic Church. The Iberian monarchs in particular were interested in religious orders like the Jesuits, who had grown wealthy and powerful in the Americas. So that is to say, right, that they had been working sort of in partnership with the church, even though they had a great say in how things were run. But under regalism, they want to increase their authority, not necessarily working hand in hand, but having more of a say, right? Making the church more part of the bureaucracy. And groups like the Jesuits, who had autonomy and were wealthy and powerful, right? And could conflict with royal authority. So here's what happens. First, the Spanish eliminated certain privileges and legal protections that the clergy had. Second, they transferred parishes, right? So parishes being the communities, religious communities, ministered by the Catholic Church, right? Different cities and areas are divided into parishes, right? And so they transferred these parishes that had been ministered to by these religious orders to secular clergy. And the reason they did this is because secular clergy, which are sort of priests and others who live within the community, not outside of it, the Spanish had the ability to appoint, right? That was part of the patronage that they had. And so eventually the Iberian monarchs, because Portuguese as well too, they would expel the Jesuits from the Americas in 1760s and would confiscate their property for its wealth. Following that, the crown would appoint priests, right? So secular clergy to take over for ministering in those areas, and high clergy bishops who supported this idea of regalism, right? Working more hand in hand, but with one hand stronger than the other, I guess to say, right? And so because of political purposes, in terms of providing barriers to power, being rivals, in the sense of, how much wealth you have and autonomy, but also the wealth, right? Being wealthy, and again, they're trying to gain money. The Spanish go about and confiscate and expel the Jesuits, right? Confiscate their land, expel them, right? And that kind of pulls together the sort of religious reform, right? And so as we get here to the end, we should revisit the question that we had asked ourselves earlier, right? Right, if we ever bring ourselves back here to the end, we are looking at our map, again, reconfiguration of empire. So what did we see? We saw the increasing of military presence in the Americas, right, in Latin America. We see political divisions or divisions of political administrations to make things more efficient, dealing with contraband and threats of invasion in the Caribbean basin, and the same thing as well in its southeast. Then we talked about how the Spanish appointed more political officials that come from the peninsula, that have less in stake in the local level and more invested in implementing and enforcing the authority of the crown. And then we looked at the confiscation and expulsion of lands from the Jesuits, property from the Jesuits and the Jesuits themselves, right? And so this is all happening on the eve of revolution, independence, and it'll be interesting to see how these reforms, right, how the response was to those living in Latin America and how they would respond later. But we'll save that for another time. Thank you for listening and watching. Take care now. Bye.